Hello and welcome back to Noxcast, an Equinox news recap podcast. I'm your host, Charlotte King. I'm the managing executive editor of the Equinox.
And I'm Nathan Ope. I'm the news editor of the Equinox, and this week we're joined by President Melinda Treadwell.
Thanks so much for having me here, Charlotte.
Glad to have
you. It's great to see you.
Thank you. This is a little bit of a special episode of Noxcast. Instead of going through all of our top stories like usual, we're going to focus primarily on the 2024 election, which has just occurred a couple days ago as of recording this. And because it's sort of the dominant topic in the discourse right now, we wanted to really afford it the space that it deserves in the newsroom, or in this case, the podcast studio. So in terms of the elections as they're relevant to us here in New Hampshire, we did for the November 7th edition of the paper this week have the results from Associated Press as they stood at the time that we exported the paper, which are currently showing for New Hampshire that Kamala Harris won the state in the presidential race. Kelly Ayotte won for governor, and Maggie Goodlander has won the District 2 congressional race. And it was kind of an interesting experience to be working on the newspaper as this election was unfolding. It was a very, I would say, very different just atmosphere to how the newsroom normally feels on a Tuesday night, which is when we always export the paper. You know, usually there's kind of a balance of, working on the individual sections that we're all responsible for, but also kind of keeping it light, keeping everybody's energy up, and just trying to, focus on, all right, here's the content that we have. We've been working on this for the past week, and then putting it out there. But this was, it really comes a lot closer down to the wire. And anybody who wasn't actively working on the content of the paper was looking at, live updates of what was going on. So it was a lot more just hushed and kind of tense, in a way that I think really illustrates the importance of, this huge moment in American history really happening in front of our eyes.
Right.
Nate, I don't know if you wanted to talk more about that.
Yeah, it's always interesting because we always do layouts on Tuesdays, so it's kind of this sort of clash between schedules of all these elections always happen on Tuesdays. But yeah, the results were the thing that I put in at the very last thing before we exported because we wanted the most up-to-date thing on that night. And this is my first time having a major election on layout night because in 2022 I was just a staff writer still. So yeah, it was definitely a new and different experience, and I was definitely looking at the results and refreshing pages as, copy editors were looking over stuff, and I was just kind of keeping an eye out on things. But I think that this election was a very different one in some cases. When you look at the polling, for example, a lot of people were expecting, maybe the polls were wrong, like in 2016 and then in 2020 in some cases. But actually, it turned out that the polls were a little bit more spot on in terms of this really is a coin flip race in a lot of cases. And you have certain things like down ballot Democrats doing better on the congressional level, on the Senate level, winning some Senate seats in states that even Trump won. And I think there's a lot to analyze, and there's a lot of post-mortem to go through on either side about strengths and weaknesses. And I think, in between these election times, there's a lot to do in terms of focusing on, state and local and how that impacts things, and community organizing and trying to lift each other up. Because, this is the election that everybody thinks about every 4 years, but there's midterms, there's the local elections that happen as well. And we'll have those off-year elections just as soon as next year. So I would urge people to sort of keep an eye out for those, especially. And, this is never the end-all, be-all. We are a democracy, and you'll have the opportunity again and again to be able to make your voice heard, and there's more than one way to do that. So I think that's something to think about after the results, which, I'm sure were definitely a shock to a good amount of people, but
Mm-hmm.
they are what they are. And I think, in 2016, when you had that divergence from the popular vote in the Electoral College, there was a lot of sort of upset feelings about that because it felt like this was, foisted upon us, basically, in some cases because of that. Oh, well, the majority didn't vote for this, but in this case, and now it looks like votes are still being counted, but it looks like Trump is on track to win both the Electoral College and the popular vote. So this is something that we have to grapple with. That at least half of the voting, a little bit more than half of the voting public, is supportive of Donald Trump and his policies. So it's something that we have to grapple with, and I think talk about going forward because this isn't something that you can really ignore.
Right. And so in terms of the experience of you can imagine us in the newsroom and the unique experience of having that Tuesday night, and which may very well be repeated when those off-year elections come around again. But I wanted to ask you, President Treadwell, to sort of give us the picture. Where were you at on Tuesday? As this was happening, where was your head at?
Yeah, so I think one of the things from an institution that I'm really proud of, I volunteered at Ward 1, and we had over 334 students who were transported to the polls to vote, many of them for the first time in a presidential election cycle. I had a lot of students who came through that line at Ward 1 from 2 to 5 o'clock on the day who drove themselves there as well. So I know there was a very large percentage of the Keene State student body that showed up. We have been, for the past 13 years, one of very few schools, the only school in the state that's part of the American Democracy Project. So I think what's so important in this conversation and the work as a campus is that we do care about democracy. We care about engaging in the topics that are important to us. We also, I think what was so hard about this election was that it was so polarizing and the rhetoric was so negative that to have the majority vote in this way, given the rhetoric, I think that's leaving people, half, if we believe the national trends, half of our student body joyful and half of our student body fearful. And I think those are really challenges that we've got to confront. And I'm sure as we'll talk today about what's next and how do we work as a campus, it'll come up. So the night after, I volunteered at the polls. And again, shout out to all of our students, faculty, and staff who did have their voices heard and count. I think I went home, of course, my kids went off to bed, and then I turned on the polls as they started to close the CNN coverage. I think what was interesting was, as Nate, you hit on a little bit, it's the up and down ballot differentials. So the state of New Hampshire went for Harris, went for a Democratic sweep on the federal electoral representation at both the House and the Senate level again. And so we have Democratic leaning in the majority vote in our state, but we elected a Republican governor. And I think as I watch those returns come in, it gives me some hope that in our state we are trying to discern amongst the issues and amongst the candidates. We're not just voting straight ticket. I think that was a thing that I was happy to see happening, is that the electorate was really trying to discern and cast their vote. And we see that in the way the state is now represented. So that's a good thing. I think as I was watching the returns come in, it's hard as a woman. Some of the rhetoric was so personally difficult to hear and to feel for my daughter, for others. I think that was really hard to process, the way in which I think gender played a lot into this, gender and race and all of those things. It's very complicated, right? There's the idea of the tax profiles and the America First kind of doctrine, the populist doctrine. Those are all reasons for people to vote for that, and I can understand it. But the fact that I think the New York Times had one of the best opinion pieces that I've seen since Tuesday where, and I'll misquote this, but the title was something like, "It's time for us to stop pretending it's not who we are as a country." I think we have to confront the fact that there is not love everywhere, as I would wish there is. There's actually a lot of pain, a lot of anguish, and a populist message is ringing true for people who are using that. And so personally, it was difficult, but as a president of a college, I'm very proud of the fact that our students showed up, and I'm very confident that we'll continue to love and hold ourselves together and create a space here where we double down on our civic engagement and we get involved. I'm glad we currently have a student serving in City Council here in Keene. I hope we have more of that. I think getting our students involved in leading at the age when they're here as students is a really important thing for us because you are the future, and I think your voices are more, regardless of how people voted for the presidential election, I think the voices of the students I know here are much more love-filled and compassionate than they are hateful. And so I'm hopeful for the future, even though at this moment there are some concerns that I have around the populist vote and what that might mean for us in the near term.
Right.
But it was a late night. I stayed up and I finally gave up at some point and I said, I'm going to have to wait. The votes are coming in so slow in some of the battleground states. But I was proud of how both candidates ended. I think they both tried to, I think Trump tried to call forward a more unifying message in his acceptance. And I think Kamala did a graceful job trying to concede in a way that was demonstrating the best of democracy. So I thought it was a good way, at least, for us to see where we step from here.
Right. One thing I wanted to ask you in terms of, we're talking about community engagement coming from students, and one of the unique aspects that I observe and that we have sometimes talked about a little bit at the Equinox is, for students, as was publicized quite a lot on campus, students have the ability to vote here in Keene regardless of where they're coming from because, if they're currently living on campus, that right is extended to them. But I also know a fair few people who vote absentee as citizens of wherever they may be coming from, another state entirely in many cases. So I was curious to maybe have you weigh in on the differences between those types of engagement and kind of, do you see any like pros or cons that come with those differences?
Sure. And so I think I'll speak from the experience over the last 13 years as being a part of, either as an early administrator or as a advisor with students, or now as president. I think what is very interesting is we've worked really hard with the state Attorney General's office, the Secretary of State, as a public university system to make sure that we're creating the right spaces and compliance under state law, number one. So I think we all do that. And Keene uniquely, as an American Democracy Project campus, worked really closely with Patty Little, the clerk in the city, with regard to registration, ways in which we could educate the students about how to share their voice, what to do to engage in the process. And over the time, I've been part of discussions in Concord around regulatory changes with regard to citizenship affirmation or some of the other requirements that are being discussed around voter rights and voter protections, if you will, around the sanctity of the vote itself. So all of those things are important, but I think the most important thing is for people to express themselves, to participate and be involved. And so whether it's by absentee or it's same-day registration or it's about registering in advance of an election and declaring domicile here, I just want to make sure our students are voting. I want to make sure our faculty, our staff are voting. A number of students who came through, some were there with friends. They had voted by absentee already, and they were there to kind of get their friends to the poll. Others were registering same day. Several had registered already and just went straight in. So I would say it was a mix of how our students showed up on that day to vote. I'm excited about, and when I was a student here, I declared domicile and voted in New Hampshire for the 3 of my 4 years. I didn't vote my first year. I voted in Maine. But I don't really have a bias or a preference in this. I think let me correct. I think it's exciting when it's a presidential run-up normally, when we had aggressive competitive primaries here. And this was an odd cycle because there really was just a Republican primary running early on, and Trump was such a dominant force. We didn't see a lot of candidates coming through New Hampshire, but normally it's wild and wacky, and almost every candidate comes through, and our students get to know and vet and question those candidates. And then I think they're the most informed electorate, and I would want them to vote here because they're engaging and they're voting in the place that they're learning. And so I think that matters to me a little bit, but vote is the important thing. And whether it's by absentee or by same-day registration or registration at your convenience, voting is the most important thing. Your votes are going to have to be part of the future of how we share and change some of the rhetoric. Because I don't think some of the more hateful rhetoric, even those who voted for Trump, they wouldn't espouse that. And I think it's important that we express that somehow, beginning next year and at the midterms and every year thereafter.
Yeah, I think it's an open question, definitely, for a lot of people, where you really feel you have a stake in the community, and I can understand both sides of that. Voting absentee, in your hometown, and whether that's in a different state or in a different town in New Hampshire, versus voting here. And I think there's an argument on either side as to where you feel that would be the most impactful, and where you feel that would be the most consistent with your life. But I think it's just important to have those choices, because there has been, some proposed legislation where they certain legislators don't really want it to be, students from out of state to be able to vote if they're going to college in New Hampshire. And I think the important thing is, if you are going to college in New Hampshire or any state, that's where you live for a majority of the year while you're in college. And any laws that are passed on the local level or the state level here will affect you.
Yes.
The fact we just elected a new governor, Kelly Ayotte, like what she wants to promote and push as part of her agenda, what the new legislator wants to push and pass, that's going to affect you while you're here. So I think it's important to recognize that students do have a stake in the community that they go to college in, and to be able to have the choice is the important thing. So that's what I would say.
I think it's also, just to add on to that, I think the election specifically for the state governor and the legislative reps at the state level for our district is really important. It has a direct impact on the state budgeting, on the support to higher ed, on the needs for colleges and universities to receive some of the attention and I hope support that we have been and will hope to receive in the future. There are very important consequences associated with that slate. So I do agree with you, Nate. I think you are neighbors, you are citizens of this town. When you're here as students, you're part of the community, and to raise your voice and be appreciated for that is what we should be doing. And we'll continue to be at the state legislature arguing for that voice to retain itself. So I think it is important. How do you feel about it? I'm interested to know what your thoughts might be, Charlotte.
So I'm an absentee voter. I have chosen to continue to vote in my hometown, which is also in New Hampshire. And for me, it's a matter of, I feel a very strong connection with the state of New Hampshire. I've lived in the same house my whole life. And for me, I'm still able to have an impact on, any community in New Hampshire that I might live in through that state level vote. And then in terms of where my head is at, like for what community I consider myself to be a part of, the answer is both. The answer will always be both, because, like Nate says, I'm living here the majority of the year, but I also have my family at home and connections there that are also just really important to me. So it's a hard question, and I think it's a hard question for just about anybody who makes the decision one way or another. But for me, it just came down to that's where my head is at. And in terms of, what I have been seeing in terms of the slate of issues that are affecting both communities that I'm a part of, I felt that my vote had more of a direct and immediate significance or relevance in the community that I consider my hometown, which isn't to say that it wouldn't have any here, but just that seemed the more pressing issue to me. And so I chose to contribute what I could, civically to my hometown, because that's where I'm going back to, basically. Once I graduate, I'll be there. And so certainly the future of that place matters a lot to me.
It affirms, I think, the fact that the student should have the choice, and we should as a community, make sure we're all aware of how to exercise those choices, make sure we raise that voice up at the Concord legislature when there are efforts to silence some of the votes. And I think that there has been really good, rigorous debate about this, and I'm super excited. Thank you for voting absentee and locally. And I mean, I think it all matters. Your voice needs to be heard.
Yeah, and I think to circle back to talking about the turnout as well, I think what we're seeing again with this election, and again, there's lots of votes left to count out west and things like that, but the turnout again is pretty high. Even when you're looking at 2020, which was the highest turnout that was seen in quite some time in terms of a percentage of the population and young people specifically, I think, it's still promising in terms of the sheer amount of people who came out to vote. And I think a lot of this election was fought based on the persuasion lines, not so much of one side didn't get enough people to turn out or the other side didn't or things like that. I think it was really came down to convincing. And I think, like you said before about the ticket splitting, I think we're seeing a return to that is kind of interesting. And the hope is that people, would examine the candidates based on the policies and qualities there, rather than, straight party vote. And, when I'm looking at my ballot, I tried before going into vote to look up all the candidates, even the most local ones, to see where they stand on the issues and, if that's something that I'd feel comfortable voting for. So I think, it's important. And I think seeing all the states who voted for Trump for president, and then on the Senate level and on the governor level in North Carolina voted for a Democrat instead, and other statewide positions, I think it's something to look at to see that, people are engaged, and there's more of a discussion to be had, given that this was very much a persuasion election. That there's gettable votes if you're on either side, and I think that's something that the campaigns are going to do a lot of reflecting on.
I think that's right.
One of the interesting things I think, you talk about looking up candidates even when it comes to sort of these hyper-localized positions. One thing that I have definitely encountered a lot, especially in my hometown, both in the past and now, is, when looking up local candidates, it can sometimes be really difficult to examine policy positions because sometimes these candidates have a hard time kind of getting the word out about their campaign and what they're trying to represent. And so I think this is an area where we can kind of speak a little bit about the importance of journalism as it relates to the entire period of time leading through an election season, and giving voters the ability to understand better the profile of the people that they're looking at and assessing, and potentially, putting their name behind, putting their strength as a citizen behind this campaign, because certainly I think it can be difficult for local candidates. They don't have the same level of just resources and ability to reach out. But, I do think that in any community, it's the responsibility of whoever might be there as press or just whoever has some type of platform or can create some type of platform through which they can find that information out and give that to voters. That's a really valuable opportunity. And we see that in instances where candidates, roll through a town or at a college, wherever it might be. And certainly at the Equinox, we try to do our share of exploring a little bit what people, what these candidates are about and what they're saying on the campaign trail. We talked a little bit in a previous episode about I had a little bit of involvement with Know Your Vote, which just wrapped up with election season from the Granite State News Collaborative, which again is sort of going into, what are these positions that people are running for? Who's running for them? What are they about? And so, I think in terms of trying to keep our community engaged, that's something that's really important to us.
Yeah, I think I'm definitely really proud of the role that we play as a student media to sort of cover any gaps in coverage in the region, and we did quite a few election related articles. In this paper, there was an article about the polarization of politics in the United States and sort of cutting through that, getting some student opinions. We did an article about alleviating some election related stress and a couple other things, but I think we've tried to do a good job on keeping that discourse going before the election and during, and then now I think after we're still going to have a couple more pieces coming out in the aftermath here, and I think making sure that we're continuing that coverage and the work that the Granite State News Collaborative is doing as well to sort of bring the state together and try to get on the same page on making sure we're covering as many bases as possible. I think it's a great resource that I wish a lot more states had something similar to that even. But I think it's definitely something that I've valued a lot in this election season, to just keep the conversation going and make students as informed as possible, because we fill that niche of the student audience and making people feel like, there's people on campus here who care about what's going on, and there's resources and, how to vote and what you're voting for and things like that. So I'm definitely proud of the role we played in that and all the news coverage. And there's a lot that goes into it because there's just so many things on the ballot. But yeah, it's a great thing.
I don't think it can be overstated. So I think one of the things, as I've thought about election politics over my lifetime, and I used to do federal policy work. And so a lot in the mid 90s, when I was doing federal policy work on air pollution, there was the growth of the junk science movement. So this idea of dispelling voices with questionable science. In fact, RFK and some of his anti-vaxxing work was happening at the same time that I was discussing thimerosal, and no direct linkage with. So I was involved in a little bit, and it was an interesting moment where, as a scientist, as someone engaged, the misinformation or the disinformation swell at that time before the internet had a profound impact on creating misperceptions or mischaracterizations, and then really drawing very clear lines and separating people. And I think when I look at the evolution through this past election, what was so striking to me were across multiple media networks where I was reading about the misinformation or disinformation campaigns, both domestic and foreign actors being involved in it. It's really difficult to discern a position on a policy or a statement of what I, as a candidate, would do. There aren't many avenues, to your point, Charlotte, and then there's so much misinformation or disinformation. To have quality journalists out there trying to bring forward the factual information and the true position through as many media streams as possible, I think is critical, and I think we're losing right now. I don't think the fact-based media, it's all getting very much centralized and monopolized, if you will, into very narrow streams. I think most of our students get their news through social media, through other media aggregation, but the algorithms are so good at singularly focusing threads of information that we're becoming more hyperpolarized as a result of the way that we're consuming our media. So I think this is a challenge and a thing I look forward to seeing how the Equinox will continue as a single element of this, but with the Granite State News Collaborative and others, we need an informed electorate. If we had an informed electorate that wasn't voting based on bombast or personality, but rather on the substance of what they're saying, what they're doing, and some deep information, I think it shouldn't be about personality. It should be about policy and the ability to get the job done in certain ways, in a way that my vote goes toward that. And I think the media information flow and the quality of the journalism, like what the Equinox did on this past cycle. I saw your articles about Chris Christie, and some of the in-depth pieces you did as those candidates were here was really helpful, really informative, and demonstrated great journalistic independence. And I think we need more of that, not less of it. And we need your help thinking, as a college and as a community, how do we help broaden the social media focusing and broaden the engagement in content that isn't just about noise and bombast, which this seemed to be more of that than I've ever seen.
Yeah, it's definitely that is the question that we all have to face. Anybody who's involved in media or education or just really anywhere where you have that kind of platform and you're reaching a population of prospective voters, the question of how do you kind of cut through the noise, cut through all of the confusion that arises when, everybody is talking over each other all the time, sometimes literally, but, that's something that we definitely continue to try and have our internal conversations about as a newspaper, but also try to, bounce off of others, other student newspapers that we know, or people from, the news collaborative, whoever it might be. And, we don't have the answer. Nobody has the one, solve all thing that will allow us to create that better space for people to engage in, where things are clearer and like you say, more based on tangible, grounded policy decisions rather than, the flair or character of, individual politicians or party campaigns, anything like that. But I think one of the most crucial things to understand for us, especially as a college paper, is in terms of, the simple fact that a lot of students are getting their news from social media. That's something that I think has gotten to a point of we just have to accept it. Social media is difficult to navigate because it's big and it's messy and it's fast and it's loud, but that's where people are because that's where they like to be. We kind of revel in the chaos a little bit at this point. And so I think the most important thing for the media to try and do is embrace the continuing rise of social media, while also not losing sight of the values that are meant to guide us, because you have to find your reader base. You have to find them where they're at. You have to meet them where they're at, and you have to, still try and get as much of the valuable info that you are collecting as you can in front of them. Maybe they won't be receptive to that. Maybe some prospective voters are going to look at, what the Associated Press or the Keene Sentinel or us, they're going to look at whatever media organization is posting online and say, this doesn't interest me because I've already made up my mind based on, a podcast appearance by a politician or, some snappy soundbite that I heard in a YouTube video or whatever it may be, whatever the thing of the week is from any given candidate. But we have to be there. We have to be an option for people to allow people to inform themselves. And then in terms of the role of education, maybe that's a little broad, but, I think for others, it can sometimes then be the challenge of trying to encourage people to go and inform themselves. Once the information is in front of them, how do you convince people to actually take it, and internalize it and then use that to make their decisions? And once again, I don't know. It's a tough challenge, but I think that's sort of where we end up, those paths cross.
I think part of what I've been thinking a lot about, I don't know if either of you have thought about this, but part of what I think is different is if we can help with greater factually grounded information in those different media streams, to your point, being in the places where people are consuming media and content, make sure that it's factual, make sure that it's not specious. So I think that's a necessary, yes, we have to do that. I think we have to educate people to know better literacy about how to discern between real and not real sources. It's not hard to actually do a few things it's getting increasingly difficult with AI, but I do think it's possible. I also think something that maybe we as a community can do that is not possible perhaps everywhere is be very purposeful about building relationships across difference, talking with one another, trying to understand, trying to help inform. I think we don't, I have different political views in my family. And oftentimes we say, oh, I don't want to get into politics. But the reality is we probably should more. Because if we were having more very personal engagement moments with people who thought like us and thought differently than us, we would be far better off, I think, as a society, because we wouldn't feel different than one another, would feel the complexity of it, which there are very complex views about the role of government and all of the different things that are on the play right now. But it's harder. It's harder for me if I knew you voted for someone I didn't vote for. If we have a relationship with one another, and I did this with my brother, like it's okay. I respect you for that, and I'm not going to have vitriol about someone who voted differently than me. I will try to understand it more. And I think it's more about us trying to not just get information and vote in the popularity contest, but get information, talk to people who may view things differently, try to sway the vote in your voice and try to learn from the vote in the other voice. I think it comes down to being human beings. And I don't think that we're doing that well right now. And I think this election, more than any that I've experienced in my adult lifetime, demonstrated such anger. So there was so much rhetoric about this election that it just made people retreat from one another. And I hope on the other side of this, we really could come to some level of unity, not have celebratory victory by one or two narrow elements of our either gender breakdown or demographic breakdown, but rather that we try to understand that really no one was victorious. We're all struggling right now. And how do we lean forward?
Yeah, I think it's interesting in some aspects too with, being the student voice of Keene State College, like we say, a lot of what we do is for stories is going up and talking to students in a lot of ways. And that's what we did with a couple of the election pieces that staffer Katie did. And she did a great job with that, I think. You never know what they're going to say when you go up to someone just, walking on Appian and saying, what are your thoughts on the election? Which way are you leaning towards? Or you even think about voting at all? But I think going into it and, as a journalist, not displaying your opinion and you're saying, what are you thinking and why is that the case? And I feel like a lot of the times that lends itself more to productivity in terms of understanding that, and it makes people feel more heard. And I think that there's a big issue with sort of, the not understanding. There's some condescension even of, oh, well, you're not voting. Well, you're not a good person. You don't understand the importance of the election.
Right.
Like, you have to ask people if they're not voting, really try to understand why that's the case. And if you can come to an understanding where they would feel more comfortable doing that, then I think that's better than saying, beating someone down and saying, this isn't, you're not doing the right thing and you understand this and that. So I think our role in the media and asking students their thoughts, no matter which way they're voting or not voting at all, I think ends up lending itself more to productivity and continuing that conversation. And I think that's something that that we did a good job with in our coverage.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's important to let people, no matter what their view, feel respected so long as it's not hateful and harmful. I think that's the important line we always try to draw. And I'm hopeful that as we go forward on the other side of this election, we're going to work very much in the local space, continue to be engaged and at the state level to make sure that we continue to do the work of this community and as an educational institution. It's important.
Yeah, and as a brief aside, I definitely do want to give a little shout out to all of our staffers who worked on various different pieces covering the election, including right now. We have some brief news pieces that are going up online, just reporting some of the results. But yeah, any of the pieces that the Equinox published, great work from our staff writers. So definitely props as always to them. But in terms of, trying to approach with that goal of understanding and then working from there, it can definitely be hard, like you say, as journalists, we're going in trying to keep just sort of a blank slate approach of like, my feelings are somewhere else right now. I'm approaching this with a method, and I want to understand this person that I'm talking to, where they're at, how they're thinking, why they're making the choices that they're making. And, I think it's tough because certainly we all have our own feelings, any person does. And some of us are, certainly politically active. But I think that, from the media perspective, it's so just valuable to approach with that kind of method. And I think the key in terms of going forward from there is that, when we talk about anger that can be inspired by the results of an election or things that are said throughout the just political process, it's my feeling that anger can be a valuable thing. It's a matter of trying to turn it around and make it something that fuels progress, fuels work. Because that's what all of this really comes down to, is we all need to keep working.
That's right.
Being a citizen of a community, any community, whether we're talking national or the college campus,
Right.
That's a job. And so every day we get up and we do that job. And so I think it's a matter of realizing that your anger is honest and it's real, and it's, regardless of where it's coming from, because for any given person, it could be about completely different things, but it's something real that I think all have at some point or another. We all feel the anger or the sadness or just some sort of strong feeling. But I think turning that around and putting it into, I feel this way, I'm now going to go and organize people in my community to go out and vote for the midterms, or, band together in support of this cause that relates to policy that we believe in, or whatever it may be. Finding that balance point, again, it's hard, but I think that's what needs to happen. And it's also what needs to happen when trying to relate to somebody who's making different decisions than you. You have to put the energy into understanding them and understanding why.
I think another valuable thing that I would encourage anyone to do is, we have an opinion section in the newspaper, and that's a great way, if you're inclined at all to write, to vent some of those frustrations. I find that it helps to make it feel like your voice can be heard, and by virtue of us having this publication, being able to print a newspaper and sort of giving people a platform to talk about how they're feeling and things like that. I think the most diverse variety of opinions we can get on there, the better. And I think it helps a lot to be able to, again, promote the student voice aspect of it and trying to understand. And I think it's going to be increasingly important for people to be able to make their voice heard in that way. And I think, we've got a good few people who are inclined more towards the opinion section. I think that their voice matters. And so I would also encourage people to, reach out to us if you have any strong feelings, especially after this election and the next few years. It's going to be tough either way. And I think having the ability to do that, I think we would love as many people as possible to sort of get their voice heard.
I think more speech is the right thing, right? That's more conversations, more dialogue. I think a couple of things just that I hope will be helpful. So as president, very much like a journalist, it's not about my personal opinions. I've shared some as a woman because I felt it was really hard to navigate that as a human being at times with some of the rhetoric. But what I would say is my responsibility is to make sure I keep the hate away from our campus, that we are in a space where people can feel safe and they belong, and that more speech is the best. And so a couple of things that from one of our last meetings where we talked about having more of a current event opportunity for people to come just during brown bag lunches or something where we could have some facilitated dialogue. The Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Commission, just to put it out in the broadcast. So we have our Wellness Wednesdays from 11 to 2 every day for any students that are faculty or staff who are feeling stressed and anxious. That's a great way to check in, and lots of fun going on in the Student Center atrium. But tomorrow, the 8th of November, from 11 to 12, and then from 12 to 1, we'll have a faculty and staff just kind of listening session, and then a student listening session. So the student session is 12 to 1 tomorrow. Those are both in the Mountain View room. And then on Friday, the 15th, there's a roundtable discussion of post-election debrief that's going to be going on in the Madison Street Lounge from 10 to 11:30. So I think what I'm hoping we'll be doing is every week, every 2 weeks, we'll be doing more of these, like just publicize open opportunities for people to come in and talk about current events, things that are going on, so we can do more about global, geopolitical, and local, and even hyperlocal based issues. So we're working to do that, and I think you both brought this up to me. So I think this is good in our diversity commission and supporting people through this, because it's a lot of processing, and more speech is going to be our only solution, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a great opportunity. Having any sort of open forum, I think, really encourages people to not just voice, the thoughts that they have about what they see going on, again, whether it's in the news, as in news outlets that publish, for their information, or just anything that they hear, word of mouth, social media, anywhere. But not only can they voice those thoughts, but also to really just connect people, and not necessarily people who agree, but connect people and give them a better understanding of the community that they're in, and I think that that's something that's valuable for anybody, because understanding the sort of broader profile of the space that you are living, working, spending your life currently in, that really gives you more of a grounded sense of who your neighbors are and where you fit in, where you fit in both as a person and as somebody who cares, who cares about whatever it is that, is at the top of your docket of priorities. It lets you know where you kind of fit in the puzzle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think, one of the worst things that could happen is for someone to feel like they're alone in how they feel, or not feel supported with their viewpoints, or, aspects of their identity they don't feel are being respected. I feel like that feeling of loneliness is probably the worst thing. And I think doing events and conversations and things where you can have that connection is something valuable in order to tackle that. And, there are people who care about you. And I think, a lot of people after the election especially are definitely checking in on their friends and family about how they're feeling. And I think it's certainly valuable to reach out to a lot of people and sort of just see where their head is at, because there's a lot of upset feelings and anger and sadness going around right now. So I think now and always to just check in with the people that you love is very important. But yeah, especially now, and to keep this conversation going, keep the community engagement going. The work doesn't start and end on election day. It keeps going 365 days every year, and to turn those upset feelings into action, I think, is probably the most valuable thing you could do. So I think that's what I would encourage people to sort of try to turn it into something productive, and allow yourself to feel those emotions, obviously.
I couldn't agree more. I think yesterday I got a call to speak at a plenary session in Boston in early December about equity in education after the election. And so there'll be some folks out of DC and two presidents and myself talking about the importance of our educational environment, creating senses of belonging, creating a space where very diverse views with respect for any identity is a really important part of education. And this is a hard time to be expressing those views in some cases because I think many people feel silenced right now. It's the very time that we and I will be leaning into that because I think it's important. So I think there's more of that to come. I think there's more regional and national voice for me to have as a president of a college where it's really important that there is love and respect for the community that I have the privilege to serve, and that we all know that the work does go on every day. And so more speech is the only solution, more action is the only work, and more education about the issues and really getting involved. Throwing some energy into it is probably the hardest thing. I think this is a call to action to all of us who care about education, who care about some of the issues that were front and center in this election. And I would say that cuts across both parties. So building the amalgamation of those things that are most important to all of us and then making something happen.
Yeah. And I think for anybody, it can be, because it can be so daunting, to engage on this, every day,
That's right.
every single day, getting up and working on these issues. And I think one of the things that certainly at least can help for a lot of people is, it's okay to sort of pick your lane a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
We're all, all three of us are voters, community members, but also in terms of, for you as president or for us as college media, those encompass a lot of the ways in which we are trying to contribute to the communities that we're a part of. And so, like for me, one thing that I find myself sometimes struggling with is I want to do everything, and so I have my role at the newspaper, but I sometimes find myself wishing that I had, additional time that I could spend going and helping with this or getting involved with this or working on this. And sometimes that's just not realistic, but that's okay because, all of us are only human, everybody. And so there's only so much that any given person can do. So in terms of the encouragement that we always want to put out there for people to get involved and be just active as citizens and as voters, the pieces are all there for you to really have that impact, and it's okay to kind of pick a lane and stick in it.
Right.
Yeah, I think there's also some tangible things that we've seen through the election results, if you look past the top of the ballot, that kind of point towards why these conversations can be valuable because, you have a state like Missouri, which voted, in favor of Donald Trump by quite a big margin. But then at the same time, their ballot had a ballot measure about protecting abortion. And then that passed as well by a pretty healthy margin. So it might not make sense to some people how you can split your ticket that way, considering Trump is on the more pro-life side of things and, also at the same time voting to protect abortion rights in the state. But there are people who do think that makes sense to share those two viewpoints and share the support for one candidate, but also on the issue itself, vote one way. And I think there is common ground, there's agreement that can be found, even with people who might, support a different politician than you on the issues. I think there's more overlap than the politicians, and especially at the top of the ticket, there's more nuance to some people's thought process than people might think.
I think that's right. And I think I just want to thank you for the chance to come and be in conversation with both of you. But I also, back to Nathan's point, I think just try to feel the love from your community and process. This is all of us need to process. Even the party that was victorious in this has to process the split ticket elements of, it's not a monolith. And I think that's really important. And I think we have work to do, but let's first start by realizing that there's a lot of love, particularly in this community, and reach out and call on your friends, check on them. and know that there's going to be more to do, and that's what's gets me up every day. So that's a good thing.
Yeah, and certainly when you look at, the split ticket of items like that, in a case like Missouri, obviously the just cultural and political climate of a state like that is going to be very different than that of New Hampshire, but we
Right.
see that shared trait that people are, picking wisely, picking in a way where they are being mindful of the differences that they might have within their own ideas of what they want for the future, and acting accordingly, voting accordingly. So I think that, that idea of love that you speak about, I'd at least like to think that, we can find that across states, across the nation, across the world, wherever we may go.
I agree, and the one last thing is that part of what I expect in the next 4 years is more state-led policy, right? That the states are going to be entrusted, and this is exactly where, when we opened the hour, it's exactly where we said you can get involved locally and at your own state and make a profound difference. And I think this example in Missouri is one where issues that are of importance can be wrestled at the state level in ways that are really profoundly important, and loving across states and regions and across the whole country. So I think, it's a hard moment for half of the population. It's a joyful moment for half, as I said earlier. And I think the commonality of trying to be good people, I hope that will prevail for all of us. I know we're going to work hard to do that here and continue to hold our values. So, but thank you. This has been really fun to hang out with both of you.
Thank you all very much for watching this week's episode of Noxcast. Next week, we'll be back with a more typical news recap as per usual, and we'll be joined by our very own sports editor, Jakob Ensko. Until then, I've been your host, Charlotte King.
And I've been Nathan Hope, and thank you to President Treadwell for joining us this week.
Thank you both so much. It's been an absolute joy. Thanks.